Tony Blair's journey, the former British Prime Minister, is back in the spotlight as he releases his memoirs, from wars in Iraq and Afghanistan to his controversial ties with George Bush. Blair attempts to tell his version of events, but will his book change anyone's mind? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Hazem Seeker. Tony Blair's memoirs, called A Journey, have hit the bookstores. Released on Wednesday, it touches on many major world events that marked his tenure as Britain's Prime Minister, most notably his decision to join the US-led war in Iraq. Blair was paid an estimated $7.5 million for the book and is donating the proceeds to a charity for injured troops. Lawrence Lee has this report on the book that promises to give readers an insight into his life at the top.
As book launches go, it's hard to decide whether this was a bang or a whimper. In this bookshop in central London, not a single person waiting for the doors to open, though the media interest in the Blair memoirs is absolutely huge.
This isn't Harry Potter, this isn't a children's book, this is a grown-up book about grown-up issues, and grown-ups buy those in different ways. So we will sell a huge amount of copies of this book today, this week and over the coming weeks. So come Christmas, this is still going to be in the top 10.
The book, all 700 pages, offers new information about the former Prime Minister's fractured relationship with his successor Gordon Brown, whom Blair accuses of having zero emotional intelligence and who's accused of losing the British elections by betraying the Blair political philosophy.
The relationship with Gordon was very, very difficult. It was also very close. And even though towards the end, I think, frankly, it was hard going on, impossible, for a large part of the time we were in government, he was an immense source of strength. His contribution to the successes of the Labour government, all the investment you talked about, was clear.
Still, it's on Iraq that most outside Britain will judge Blair. In the book, he says the aftermath was more bloody, more awful, more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. And he admits, I can say that never did I guess the nightmare that unfolded, and that too is part of the responsibility. But all the same, no regrets.
How can you not feel sorry about people who have died? I mean, you would be inhuman if you didn't think that. But when I'm asked whether I regret the decision, I have to say I take responsibility for it, but I can't regret the decision.
People write these things to help determine how history will judge them. He does admit to some mistakes while in office here, but not that many. And certainly for a man who tried to redraw the map of British politics, appeal to so many different people, he does still cut an extraordinarily divisive character. And so at the book launch, the anti-war protesters continue to accuse Blair of having blood on his hands.
Tony Blair does actually recognise in the memoirs that the decisions that he took over Iraq actually led to a catastrophe. But at the same time, he says he doesn't regret it, which is an extraordinary position.
While one of the first people to buy the book said history was judging Blair too unkindly.
What would you do after September the 11th? It's not, we wouldn't go there, because that's not what the question is. The question is, what would you do if you were Prime Minister? And he had to make a decision, and he did it,
Even the decision to donate all the money from the book sales to charity hasn't stopped some from criticising Tony Blair, who's amassed a fortune since retiring from politics. The fact that his books are up against a well-known fantasy writer will no doubt provide ammunition to those who say his version of history bears little resemblance to the truth. Lawrence Lee, Al Jazeera in London.
Well, joining us now today are our guests in London, the New Statesman's senior political editor Mehdi Hasan, in Washington, D.C., Niall Gardner, director of the Heritage Foundation's Margaret Thatcher Centre for Freedom, and in Beirut, Rami Khouri, editor-at-large of the Beirut-based Daily Star newspaper. Now, Mehdi Hasan, gentlemen, first of all, a warm welcome to all of you. Mehdi Hasan, if I could start with you. There are many people on the left and right of British politics who will hold Tony Blair an equal amount of disdain these days. Will this book have done anything to change people's perceptions of him?
Well, I'm one of those people who holds him in disdain, and it hasn't changed my perception of him. I think it's a 718-page, 22-chapter version of Je ne regrette rien. He's a man who's come out with this book. It's a self-serving memoir, as these books tend to be. You heard him just there in your package pointing out that he doesn't have regrets for various catastrophes that occurred on his watch. I think he offers only about one real apology from what I've seen so far of the extracts, and that's for the Millennium Dome, that multi-million-pound white elephant from 10 years ago. not for the catastrophic invasion of Iraq, not for cosseting the bankers who then crashed the economy, not for rising inequality on his watch. And, you know, he says at one stage in the book, you know, I don't want this to turn into one of those self-justifying books, but I fear it may. It has, and I don't think it's going to change perceptions of it. I think the people who don't like him are going to not like him more.
Rami Khouri, your view on this, how will this be viewed in the Middle East? Has he done anything to change anyone's minds? Or perhaps, while there may not be many people who will change his view of his decision, will there be a greater insight into what went into that decision, perhaps?
Oh, no, I don't think there'll be much more insight. I think many people, not all, but many people in the Middle East, myself included, thought very negatively of Tony Blair when he was in office, particularly for the Iraq war situation and for doing very little on Palestine, as he had said he was going to try to do on Palestine-Israel with George Bush. And so I think many of us feel that he was a political and a moral catastrophe when he was in office, and his years since leaving office have turned a catastrophe into a walking calamity. I mean, he's become even worse in the eyes of many people as a quartet envoy to the peace process, doing virtually nothing, making huge amounts of money, and assuming no moral responsibility, no sense of accountability for not just the specific things that he did in office, but the consequences of what he and Bush did in Iraq. The reverberations of what they unleashed will be with us and the world in the form of terrorism and political polarization and anger and extremism and fragmentation will be plaguing us and the world for decades probably to come. And I think people like this need to be held accountable somehow, not just by not running for another election, but by moral and legal standards of international culpability.
But Rami Khouri, it's also been argued by some of Blair's supporters that Britain's involvement in Iraq may have done something to curb the excesses of America's involvement. They point to the British Army's mission in southern Iraq and the relatively peaceful outcome there. So would a US-led invasion of Iraq without Britain have been even worse, perhaps?
Oh, it probably would have been, but you're talking about, you know, a minor criminal as opposed to a major criminal. I think these kinds of comparisons are really pretty meaningless. But I think, to be fair to Blair, he's a very talented man who did some really great things in England and Northern Ireland in that peace process. I think there's many things that history will give him high marks for. But on the Middle East is where I'm judging him. From the region I know best, he's been a calamity and a catastrophe, and he keeps adding insult to injury with his statements, saying I'll do it again. And he's now talking about Iran, just as he and Bush talked about Iraq, that there's this great threat. They want to make nuclear weapons. There's not a shred of evidence that he can bring to the table, and he says we should not rule out military means to do this. So this kind of rampant abuse of power and predatory, aggressive policies by big Western powers at some point has to be held accountable to international standards. So you can't have these characters running around with their armies doing whatever they want, and then when it's done, they make $7.5 million by selling books.
All right, Niall Gardner in Washington. It's pretty fair to say that Tony Blair has plenty more admirers in the United States these days than he does in Britain. What do you think is behind that? Is that a failure on his part?
Well, I don't think so. I do think Tony Blair is a very popular figure in the United States. He was when he was Prime Minister. He remains so today. His book is expected to be a huge bestseller on this side of the Atlantic. I think that Blair was wrong on many aspects of his leadership, especially his economic policy, European policy. But I think he was absolutely right over Iraq and the war on terror. And most Americans remember Tony Blair's leadership because he sided with the United States in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. He stood shoulder to shoulder with America. That meant a great deal to the United States. Blair, of course, also stood shoulder to shoulder with the United States in the liberation of Iraq. And I think the fact that 30 million Iraqis have been freed from tyranny is something to be hugely proud of. And I think that Tony Blair's defense of his Iraq policy will actually be broadly welcomed here in the United States. And I think that Blair certainly acted out of conviction and principle over Iraq, and the people of Iraq are immensely better off after the liberation from Saddam Hussein's rule.
Well, you say that, but even by the most conservative estimates, about 100,000 people have died in Iraq in the 7 years since that invasion. Millions have been displaced, and now as American troops draw down, there's a danger that the country could again slide into civil war. I mean, his critics will say that it was fundamentally the wrong decision to join the US-led campaign.
Huge numbers of people were killed in Iraq by insurgents. Many of the insurgents are backed by Iran. Let's not forget that the Al-Qaeda network and its assorted terrorist affiliates are responsible for the vast majority of deaths in Iraq in recent years. And let's also remember the fact that Saddam Hussein brutalized his own people. He killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. And the United States and Great Britain should take great pride in the liberation
Can I come in here?
of Iraq from
Hussein, you want
tyranny.
to respond to that?
Opinion polls do show, I think, a majority of Iraqis are grateful for the liberation from Saddam Hussein.
I respect Niall's views from America, but it's ironic that we're having this discussion today, and Blair's book is out today, on the day after the United States ended combat operations in Iraq. I mean, the world's moved on since 2003, I think Niall would agree. America elected an anti-war president on Iraq. Iraq war is very unpopular with the United States. Polls show that the Americans no longer stopped backing the Iraq war long ago. They lost 4,400 American troops, around 34,000 American soldiers injured. So I find it fascinating, the irony of the date of publication of this book. I also think it's quite interesting that Niall mentioned Al-Qaeda. One of the things Blair really needs to address in this book, and doesn't really do so much, he talks about the London bombings in 2005, talks about 9/11, but of course, in recent weeks, we had our former MI5 chief, the former head of our domestic security services, admit that invading Iraq heightened the terrorist threat to the United Kingdom. This is one of the things Blair is responsible for. And reading his chapter on Iraq, what I'm amazed by is he puts up such a little defence. He puts up such a weak defence for the invasion of Iraq. He rehearses rather old and stale arguments about inspections, about sanctions. It's written in a poor prose to begin with, but the arguments are so weak. And I know George Bush has got his memoir coming out in November. Perhaps we'll see a better argument from him, but Blair doesn't even bother to engage his critics properly in his book. The book is so, I would argue, he's so arrogant in the book that he doesn't even engage in the best arguments of his critics. It's so set in the past, and I think Niall's arguments are also slightly outdated.
Niall, you want to respond to that?
Yes, certainly. I do need to have an opportunity to read more detail what Blair has said exactly on Iraq in his book. But I would say that I'd point to a huge rally over the weekend here in Washington that drew nearly 500,000 people paying tribute, actually, to the sacrifice of American servicemen and women in Iraq and Afghanistan. To say that there has not been strong support in the United States for the war in Iraq is simply not true. And I would say,
do the majority
with
of Americans
to
support the Iraq war now?
Threat, I do. We're not fighting the Iraq war anymore in Iraq, but I
You're
do
defending
recall,
it right now, so I'm just wondering
majority
whether
of
you reflect
Americans
public opinion in America.
backing the decision to liberate Iraq. But on Al-Qaeda, I do think
because they were told they were
WMDs,
WMDs, and that's the fundamental flaw in the Blair book.
Tony Blair was absolutely right to address the Al-Qaeda threat. And I do believe that Great Britain and the United States together have played a vital role in dealing with the greatest threat of our time, frankly, the threat posed by Islamist terrorism. I do think that Blair should be given credit for that. I don't support all of Blair's various policies on a wide array of issues, but I do believe he's absolutely right with regard to the war on terror, and his decision to stand alongside the United States in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 was absolutely the right decision to take as British Prime Minister.
But Niall Gardiner, you talk about the threat from Islamist terrorism and the global war on terror. I mean, if we're talking about 9/11 here, the intelligence on that has been thoroughly discredited. I mean, the 9/11 attackers, there is no evidence at all to suggest that there was any link to Iraq, that there was any link to Saddam Hussein. Yet the Bush administration at that time was making that link.
I think we should shed no tears over the removal of a brutal tyrant, and I think this set a very good example, frankly, for other tyrants across the Middle East to look at. And Blair, of course, I believe is absolutely right on Iran. Iran is a massive threat to international security. And I think his comments on the Iranian issue will attract widespread attention in the United States. There is growing support for tougher, stronger measures to be taken against Tehran, including the possibility of military force. And Blair is right to say that we have to place the possible use of military action against Tehran firmly on the table. And that, I do think, is a robust position which is likely to be supported by most Americans.
Rami Khouri, I just want... Rami Khouri, go ahead.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. I mean, we're hearing these extraordinary reruns of the arguments of 2003, all of which have been proven to be either factually wrong or politically deficient. I mean, the argument on Al-Qaeda, for instance, the threat of terrorism around the world by radical militant Salafi terrorists is much greater now than it was before 2003. Of course, they did a lot of killing in Iraq, but they only did the killing in Iraq after the Anglo-American invaders gave them the opportunity to do that and provided a magnet that attracted tens of thousands of these killers from all over the region, some of whom we've suffered here in Lebanon and in Jordan and all over the Middle East and in Times Square and in London, and almost every attempt to bomb an airplane now in the Western world or bomb a Times Square or something, the person says, I was angered by the war in Iraq, what the British and the Americans were doing. So it's true that Saddam Hussein was a terrible tyrant and he was held accountable by the British and American armies. Is it fair to ask that the American and British leaders also be held accountable to some other standard of accountability for the consequences of their actions? Forget about Saddam Hussein, but everybody has to be held accountable.
No, Gardner, I mean, Tony Blair has made reference to this in his book that he regrets the outcome of his decision. While he hasn't expressed regret for the decision itself, he has expressed regret for the outcome, and he said he is deeply sorry for that. But there, again, is no sense of accountability here.
Yeah, so you're sorry, you killed tens of thousands, trillions of dollars.
The comparison between Tony Blair and Saddam Hussein is frankly absolutely ludicrous. You're comparing
it's not a comparison. It's not a no. I'm sorry.
With the Prime Minister of Great Britain.
It's not a comparison between two people.
This issue of holding Tony Blair to account for freeing 30 million people, I think is a ludicrous suggestion.
We're not saying they're the same kind of people. We're saying that political power has to be held accountable. Political leadership comes with responsibility and accountability. If it's an Arab tyrant or a British or an American warrior, they have to be held accountable to international legal and moral standards.
I'm not equating them.
They're different kinds of people.
Are you saying the Iraqi people would be better off under Saddam Hussein? I mean, is this what you're saying here? Because
that's not what I'm saying.
I do believe that's the argument you're putting forward.
That's not what I'm saying at all, and I won't accept words being put in my mouth. I'm saying the Iraqi people lived under terrible tyranny in Iraq, and I went to Iraq several times under Saddam Hussein and visited, and I saw it, and it was an awful place. It was the most terrible police state that I have ever experienced in my whole life, maybe after Russia only. It was an awful place. But the consequences of political leadership is what we're talking about, not equating Iraq today and Iraq then. So do political leaders get away with anything they want to do and then just express their regrets? I think not. I think people have to be held accountable. And, you know, Tony Blair is like a living cluster bomb, that the damage that he does will go on for years and years after he has been deployed, that what he unleashed in Iraq and the Middle East with George Bush will go on causing immense suffering.
Let's go back to what you said earlier about Al-Qaeda. Let's not forget the Al-Qaeda attacks upon the United States were carried out before the liberation of Iraq.
And the 7/7 attacks on London were carried out after Iraq, Niall, as you well know.
Responsible for Al-Qaeda terrorism.
Sure.
We took on Al-Qaeda in Iraq. We emphatically defeated them, and we broke their back. We killed tens of thousands of Al-Qaeda terrorists
Blair and Bush put Al-Qaeda in Iraq.
That is a great achievement for Britain and the United States.
Misrepresentation of history.
All right, Mehdi Hassan, you want to jump in here for a second?
Well, first of all, we put al-Qaeda in Iraq. There was no al-Qaeda in Iraq before we went there, so that's a ludicrous misrepresentation by Niall. On the subject of Blair in Iraq, returning to this book, I mean, whether Blair likes it or not, what's really interesting, yes, he's never going to be held accountable in a court of law. He did win the 2005 election, amazingly, after the Iraq War, but this is going to follow him around forever. I mean, it's the ghost that will haunt him. He cannot get away from Iraq in that sense. And I think, you know, they say Queen Mary, when she died, they cut open her heart and they found the words Calais embedded on her heart. I think if they were to open Blair's heart after he dies, you'll find Iraq burned in there. He's never going to get away from it. This will transcend everything else. Rami mentioned earlier he did a lot of good things at home. He did. Sitting here in Britain, I can say that Labour, under Tony Blair, improved public services in this country, improved the infrastructure of this country, helped lift children out of poverty. But all of that will be forgotten in the long run by historians who will only see the catastrophe of Iraq that Blair brought about by going to George Bush's side at that time.
Yeah, I mean, Mehdi, I just want to pick up on what you said earlier about the 2005 election, which he won, and he was the first Labour leader to win 3 elections. By that time, we were 2 years into the war in Iraq, and it had become pretty clear that it wasn't a cakewalk, as some had predicted it would be, and it was pretty clear that there were no weapons of mass destruction. So the British people had the chance to vote him out, and they chose not to. So how does that explain the way he's reviled, continued to be reviled in Britain?
Well, first of all, Iraq's got even worse since the 2005 election, so that explains, you know, the main violence in Iraq took place in 2006. Second of all, he did win the election, but don't forget, we don't have a proportional electoral system. His vote collapsed. I mean, Labour lost 4 million votes over Tony Blair's 10 years in office.
But they still had a working majority.
Of course they did, but you're asking why wasn't he not punished? He was punished in 2005. His majority dropped from 160 to around 60. The fact that he didn't lose was because he was opposed by a Conservative Party that was totally out of touch with the British public and which hadn't yet elected David Cameron, the modernising leader of their party. They were elected by a kind of a right-wing fringe leadership. But the bigger issue is this. Blair says now in his book that Labour could have won this year and Gordon Brown lost because he didn't carry on the New Labour project. He didn't govern as Blair would have wanted him to govern, ignoring the fact that 4 million voters left Labour over those 3 elections. That Labour was in decline far before Gordon Brown. And this self-justifying book, again, ignores that point and acts as if Labour collapsed to defeat only under Gordon Brown and only because of Gordon Brown. For example, the financial crash. Those bankers, those bonuses, that lack of regulation was unleashed on Prime Minister Tony Blair's watch. He happened to get out of action. He happened to get out of office 1 year prior to the crash. Very convenient and very lucky. He's always been Teflon Tony, a very lucky man.
All right, that is going to have to be the last word, gentlemen. We are unfortunately running out of time, but I want to thank all of our guests for taking part in the discussion. Mehdi Hassan in London, Niall Gardner in Washington, and Rami Khouri in Beirut. Many thanks for your time.
Thank you.
And we want to thank all of you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.